Zimbabwe, engaging with the kind of post-2000 events through a very critical Pan-Africanist, feminist, post-colonial lens. Horace is with us tonight to talk about his latest book. As you may have seen, we're delighted once again to have our friends at Octopus Books to sell Horace's book, as well as other interested books. So after the talk and after the Q&A, I'm sure Horace wouldn't mind to do some autographing if you wish. Now we have to be patient with Horace because he just drove in about an hour ago from Syracuse. So he's still catching his breath and getting used to the slightly colder weather than these times. And then, so he'll talk for 30, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have Q&A for another half hour. Without further ado, Horace.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to try with no, you can reach it?
Oh, okay. Okay, all right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
How are you all? Thank you for coming out. When I was walking here, Blair told me that there are no more than 50 members of staff who focus on questions of Africa. And I thought, what riches for you to have a university where you're beginning to see the future. So we know of the work of African Studies in Ottawa for many years because in my earlier career I was part of the Canadian intellectual culture, having studied in Toronto. And so I know that there's always the attempt for Canadians to develop an independent point of view. And I'm hoping that tonight our work and our engagement with questions of the destruction of Libya and the questions of transformation and peace in Libya will be part of this attempt at developing a new outlook on Africa. So I want to thank the African Studies in Carleton. You are here in the Canadian capital, and you are in the midst of the experiment of biculturalism, multiculturalism, and multilingualism, which is always a challenge. And so developing the institute here would be very important for the work that you'll do in the future to engage with people. So Blair, thank you very much. And Blair mentioned the work that I've done on Southern Africa and my book, which is called Reclaiming Zimbabwe, The Exhaustion of the Patriarchal Model of Liberation. Tonight, I want to engage you with a discussion on global NATO and the catastrophic failure in Libya. Global NATO and the catastrophic failure in Libya is the subject of my book. 2 weeks ago, the New York Times carried an article about the struggles over the central bank in Libya. They made mention of Mr. Sadek Omar al-Kabir, who is the governor of the Central Bank of Libya, and General Khalifa Haftar. And the report in the New York Times 2 weeks ago was about who would control the Central Bank of Libya. The governor of the Central Bank, Mr. Sadek Omar al-Kabir, is in Tripoli. General Haftar is someplace north of Benghazi. And General Haftar wants the governor to give up his position because he's proclaimed himself to be the leader of Libya. Now, when you read the story of the New York Times further, you'll know that what is at stake is $100 billion in the bank. And so that brought to the forefront was what was at stake in the NATO intervention in Libya. So today, as we speak, 10th of February 2015, the peoples of Libya have no peace. Gaddafi was a dictator, he was authoritarian, but there was social peace in Libya. There are over 1,700 militias running around Libya. Last August, the Western embassies, who had proclaimed that they were in Libya to bring peace and transition, they left Libya. They went by road. So the fact that Libya has spiraled out of control, according to the Washington Post, the country appeared on the verge of spiraling into further chaos. Rumors circulate in Tripoli that the tanker had come on attack and caught fire, and the fire raged on in Sirte. This was one group trying to control an oil tanker and selling it on the open market. So every day we have information about these struggles in Libya. But why? This gives us an indication. And in fact, what I would reduce this to is a struggle between the Treasury of the United States and the CIA. Because General Hifter was, for 20 years, living in Northern Virginia and went back to join the rebellion in 2011. And in 2013, he launched a coup to take power. But he launched a coup and nobody listened. And he had a thing called Operation Dignity. So I am proposing that today there's a war going on in Libya between different sections of Western imperial forces to capture Libyan resources. And General Hifter is supported by Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Misrata, which is another section of Libya of the left, they're supported by Qatar. And what we do not have in the popular media, and this is why the universities have to become more engaged, is who are the authors of this destruction and why information warfare is so central to the struggles for control over Africa. Information warfare. So tonight we want to focus on the relationship between the African Union and Libya and Pan-Africanism. I'm going to say straight out that the intervention in Libya was part of an effort to derail the Pan-African project. What is the Pan-African project? The Pan-African project is part of a global project of the third world people. It's a project for bread, peace, and justice. If you read the book by Vijay Prashad, and he talks about the South Project, the Pan-African project is part of the South Project. It's a project of how to reconstitute society in those countries that hitherto have been exploited and dominated by the northern liberal societies. And in the beginning of the book, Vijay Prashad puts out that we have come to the end of the liberal project. The liberal project, which is inscribed in the G7, and now in the book he talks about the South Project. The South Project, which is part of the struggle for a new international economic order. That transition is never smooth. And that transition involves Africa, because as most of you know, Africa is the center of the most dynamic transformation in world politics today. The most important aspect of the transformation is for the first time in 400 years, Africa is recovering from the demographic disaster of the transatlantic slave trade. And the demographic dividend in Africa is feeding into the creativity and into the attempts by Africa to establish new forms of political relations. How does Libya fit into this? Where is Libya? And how does it fit into this? Well, Libya is at that crossroads of Africa, which has always been part of the intersection between three different peoples. Libya was part of the ancient region that was called Carthage, and Carthage impinged on the Mediterranean. That meant it had great relations with the people across the Mediterranean Sea, the people to the east that is in the Arabian Peninsula, and where Libya belongs, sitting on the great African aquifer. Now, in political science and in African studies in North America, they've created a new concept in Africa called Sub-Saharan Africa. We don't know what that is. This Sub-Saharan Africa is what the specialists in the State Department and in international institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank create a division between the peoples who live in different parts of Africa. So if you live south of the Nile, you live in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you live in the north of the Nile, you live in what is called North Africa. And this expedient of dividing Africa like this comes from a long tradition of people who talked about Africa and Egypt not part of Africa. So we hear about this thing that Egypt is not part of Africa. And so what happened in 2011, they call it the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, that is what the media calls what happened in 2011. We don't call it the Arab Spring, because the peoples of North Africa are Africans, especially the Amazigh people, who have been Arabized and Islamicized in the past 700 years. So the Pan-African project is a project which is to reconstitute the political and economic unification of Africa so that Africa can participate in the international system. Now, Libya had a leader called Gaddafi. He's here in the middle. And those of us who are old enough, and I think there are one or two of you in the room here, remember that Gaddafi was not someone who was looked upon by progressive Pan-Africanists, because when Tanzania was in the forefront of leading the struggles in Southern Africa, Gaddafi supported a dictator by the name of Idi Amin. And because I come out of the East African tradition, we never supported Gaddafi. So this talk is not about Gaddafi, it's about understanding Libya. It's about understanding Libya in the context of the Pan-African project. Gaddafi was there for more than 42 years, and in December 2010, a young man called Mohamed Bouazizi raised the question of neoliberalism in Africa. And Mohamed Bouazizi stood up and immolated himself and set off a chain of events of a new form of political organizing in Africa. In Tunisia, we had the youth, the women, the workers, setting out to establish a new form of intervention in politics. It said the people want to remove the regime. Asma Mahfouz and the April 6th movement took it further in Egypt. So from January 25th to February 11th, the peoples of Egypt carried out one of the most thorough revolutions since the Haitian Revolution in the Pan-African world. So these two uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt are part of what we call the African Awakening. That is the reconstitution of African politics in order for the people to fight the austerity measures that have been imposed by the international financial institutions. You saw 2 weeks ago where the people of Greece have also registered their opposition to the austerity measures of the US. So the fight against neoliberalism, which is still in its embryo, because the Egyptian revolution was very profound, and we have a book put out by Pambazuka called The African Awakening, where we went through the positive elements of the Egyptian revolution. And that revolution is still in its embryo because the counter-revolution that has assaulted the Egyptian people, and every day we see in the news elements of that counter-revolution with the military seizing power. And last week they tried to mobilize people to come out on their side. But the Egyptian process is still in its embryo. In fact, we would say that if we think of the French Revolution from 1789 to 1815, we're still very early in that revolutionary process. Egypt, which is to the east of Libya, is the most important country in North Africa, and in that place that they talk about Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism. That is, the people in Egypt who identify with Arabia and with Pan-Africanism. Nasser was the most important of such leaders. Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism is an attempt to merge the anti-imperialist traditions of North Africa. So Gaddafi associated himself with Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism. Inbuilt in Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism is a form of economic nationalism. And Gaddafi was not averse to exercising those forms of economic nationalism. In 1973, Libya was at the forefront of the nationalization of the oil resources and of the formation of OPEC. Now, we know OPEC was later manipulated so that the excess dollars from OPEC were recycled back into Western banks. But in 1973, it was a challenge. So, the weakness of Libya was that the Gaddafi regime maintained power by demobilizing the people of Libya. In other words, Libyan society was underdeveloped at the political level because of the authoritarianism of the Gaddafi regime. And so the imperial forces, in the face of the Egyptian revolution, the imperial forces established themselves in Libya with the pretext of what they call responsibility to protect. In February, not even a week after Mubarak was removed, not a week, the imperial forces came up with the idea that Gaddafi was about to carry out genocide against his citizens. We now know that that is not the case. We now know that 10 times the number of persons have been killed by the NATO forces than by the Gaddafi regime. But with his very reckless nature of speech, Gaddafi call these people rats and dogs, and gave the legitimacy for the external forces to come in with the idea that they're going to protect the Libyan people. The United Nations was used as the platform for Western intervention in Libya. But why? What I've now shown in my book is that in December 2010, Libya had taken control of the Arab Banking Corporation. Actually, this man is now the chairman of the Arab Banking Corporation, because Libya is a controlling group. Now, the Arab Banking Corporation is a consortium of banks from the Middle East. So Gaddafi and Libya had been using the resources of Libya with what they call economic diplomacy to strengthen Libya's position in the Middle East and North Africa. And we now know in the what is called the financialization of energy markets that the derivatives that had been established by these oil companies, that they were threatened by Gaddafi's talk about nationalization and diversifying their sources of oil sales. And in my book, I talk about the dalliance of Goldman Sachs and the Libyans. So what is at stake here is the fact that Libya then and now had over $200 billion in reserves. And the Libyan leadership wanted to use those reserves to be the anchor for the African monetary system and African Central Bank. And that is why one could not understand the statement by the President of France, Mr. Sarkozy, that we will fight to save the euro. So the actual intervention in Libya is part of a fight to save the European currency. And as you know, of the countries of the European Union that have created a monetary union without a political union, it is sitting in a very delicate situation. We have a three-tiered union with Germany, Austria, and Netherlands as countries that are much more solvent, and then you have those countries that have been super exploited like Greece, Portugal, and Spain. But the one that is in the most delicate situation of those European countries is a country that is called France. And some of you know that the three top French banks have been in trouble for a long time. Now France maintains control over African resources because there are 18 countries that have to keep their reserves in the CFA franc. Is that clear, or do I have to repeat that? There are 18 countries. I think Burkina Faso is one of them.
It is.
That's the kind of scholarship we need to do. Why France would be afraid of an African monetary union and would be afraid of African monetary cooperation. In my book, I'm arguing that this was the main basis for the war against the people of Libya, and that the NATO used the expedient of responsibility to protect to destroy Libya and to hijack the Pan-African project of monetary union, and if not hijack it, to stall it. Responsibility to protect. Now, when the UN resolution was passed, Resolution 1973, it is so ignominious that we will never forget this resolution. There's some African countries, South Africa, abstained. China, Brazil, Russia abstained because South Africa abstained. They were following the lead of Africa. Because responsibility to protect was not a mandate for regime change. It was not a mandate for regime change. But France and Britain, who are the European powers who are threatened by African unity, saw it as a mandate for regime change. The President of the United States and the Pentagon was against the NATO intervention. The Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, has written in his book, the book called Duty, about why the Pentagon was initially opposed to the NATO intervention in Libya. But the three humanitarian warriors, Samantha Powers, Hillary Clinton, and Susan Rice, tipped the balance in favor of the banks and the foreign policy establishment that wanted intervention in Libya. And so the war against the Libyan people began in March 2011. And this war was supposed to be protecting the Libyan citizens, but after 3 days, when the Libyan military machine was disabled, one would ask, why would this war be continuing? So March turned into April. And the African Union said, well, this is about regime change. This is not about responsibility to protect. And the African Union introduced what's called the roadmap. The roadmap. The African Union roadmap. African Union roadmap called for the immediate cessation of all hostilities, the cooperation of the competent Libyan authorities to facilitate the timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to the needy populations, the protection of foreign nationals, including the African migrants living in Libya, the adoption and implementation of the political reforms necessary for the elimination of the causes of the current crisis. This African Union roadmap was accepted by the African Union the 25th of March, not a week after the UN resolution 1973. And from March until today, what I want to stress is that this roadmap is not over. From March 2011 until today, it has been the objective of the African Union to intervene in Libya to bring about a cessation of hostilities. And up until today, the United Nations, dominated by NATO, is opposed to the intervention by Africa in Libya to stop the hostilities that are going on there. Let us look at some elements of the African Union roadmap. The cooperation of the competent Libyan authorities to facilitate the timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to the needy population. You will note that although it was supposed to be a humanitarian mission, the United Nations and the NATO powers did not care about the needy population. The protection of foreign nationals, including the African migrants living in Libya. There are about 1 million Africans working in Libya at the time. And when all the foreign forces withdrew their personnel, Turkey, Brazil, India, China, the Africans who worked in Libya were called mercenaries. And black-skinned Africans were targeted. And those who were going into Libya to protect citizens had no care for the Africans who were being targeted by this group of Libyans that were supposed to be fighting for bringing down the regime. So here it is. Here it is. NATO is supposed to be fighting terrorism in Africa. But NATO goes to the very same people who are designated as international terrorists and mobilize those persons to overthrow Gaddafi. And so the very same jihadists, oh, we are in a worldwide war against terror. Those were the forces, especially the Libya Islamic Fighting Group. And people who have been arrested, people who are held by the British, by the French, identified by the United States as terrorists. These were the people mobilized. And because the peace movement has been so effective in North America, the Western forces experimented in Libya with a new kind of war. It's a new kind of war where you ensure that you do not engage with thousands of ground troops, what they call boots on the ground. So in the war against the people of Libya, they used 4 different means of fighting the people of Libya. The first was bombing by air. And they bombed the people of Libya from March 19th until October 20th. And we can see the results of those bombing in the destruction of Libya. Bombing by air and the use of drones. Second, mobilizing militias. That is, young, unemployed, who suffer from the crisis of neoliberalism, or given guns and organized to fight. Third, special forces like the British SAS or French paratroopers. And fourth, third country nationals. So this Libyan intervention was an experimentation, a new kind of war of Libya. The Canadians, who under the present leadership have identified themselves with the most conservative wing of NATO, was right in there with their planes. As you know, NATO was divided because some sections of NATO knew what the war was about. They knew it was to control the oil and the wealth of Libya. Germany was opposed, Poland was opposed, and we went into great length in the fact that NATO was divided, that Germans, that there are only 7 or 8 members of NATO who supported this intervention. So we have this war that's going on in Libya. So the West is faced with a new form of warfare called asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare is warfare where the level of weaponry and the nature of the fighting between different forces are unequal. And we've seen in North Africa and the Middle East that the forces who have designated themselves as anti-West have been able to tie down Western military forces for the past 13 years. Well, what we do know is that these forces that are fighting asymmetric warfare, they themselves are financed and supported by Western forces or Western allies. The most famous of these are the group that is now called ISIL. Where did they come from? Who are they? They didn't exist 5, 10 years ago. How did they suddenly achieved such importance. And this is why those of us who are scholars and serious intellectuals have to do the kind of work which will expose the linkages between certain military forces, especially military forces in Saudi Arabia and Turkey with what is called ISIL. Part of maintaining control over the citizens of the West is what I call in this book information warfare. Information warfare is to confuse the citizens of the West about terrorism. Information warfare is to keep the people of the West in a perpetual state of fear. And in this information warfare, you need jihadists, even if you have to finance the jihadists. Let me go quickly, because Gaddafi was executed on October 20th. And not only was Gaddafi executed, he was humiliated and sodomized, which was a clear attempt to humiliate Africans. Why was it necessary to execute Gaddafi? Was it because of the secrets that he had? Was it because of the collaboration between Gaddafi and Western intelligence agencies, which we now have a treasure trove of information that came from the vault? This would make for a big research project for the Center of African Studies here to see the role of the Western intelligence agencies with Gaddafi. When things change, this would be a very good research project for historians. Let me just turn your attention for a second to the U.S. ambassador to Libya at that time, a man that was called Ambassador Stevens. Here was an ambassador of the United States of America who, less than a year after Gaddafi was killed, was in the process of working with the CIA to recruit jihadists to fight in Syria. I want to come back to the point about these forces that are called terrorists. The U.S. Ambassador Stevens was a cheerleader for those forces that were in the forefront of overthrowing Gaddafi. And he was caught in a firefight between the forces that they had supported in Benghazi. And I call this information warfare because up to now the citizens of the West are not fully aware of the fact that General Petraeus had been using Benghazi and eastern Libya as a base to recruit jihadists to fight in Syria. We know this because the girlfriend of General Petraeus has documented this in a book called All In, that actually he was holding some of them as prisoners in Benghazi. So the work that we have to do as scholars is to cut through the information warfare and the kind of cover-up and manipulation of information. There's a book I would want to recommend to you. It's called Cover-Up of Convenience. The book is called Cover-Up of Convenience. It's about the manipulation of the West about the information on the Lockerbie air disaster in 1988. And this book, Cover-Up of Convenience, is an indication of the collusion between Western intelligence agencies and the media in hiding information from people. So, from the Pan-African point of view, we have to support thinking and research that can end the kind of authoritarianism that we had in Libya, but also to oppose at the same time the Western manipulation of information about Libya. When Nelson Mandela defeated Mr. Gaddafi after he was released, and the Western countries said to him, "Why are you entertaining Libyan?" Mandela says, "Those who say that I should not be here are without morals. I am not going to join them in their lack of morality. This man Gaddafi helped us at a time when we were all alone, when those who say we should not come here were helping our enemy, South African white government." So this is the hypocrisy of the West. They were trying to dictate to Mandela. And I bring this to your attention because after the Lockerbie incident, Libya was charged with the crime of bringing down that jet. Gaddafi said they didn't do it. But Mandela intervened, and Mandela negotiated for ending the sanctions. Mandela went from England, from Europe, to Libya twice in a week, negotiating to end the sanctions, because Mandela himself knows about labeling people, because he himself had been labeled as a terrorist. We consider ourselves comrades in arms. You have given military training to South Africans who wanted to obtain their liberation through armed struggle. Your readiness to provide us with the facilities to forming an army of liberation indicate your commitment to the fight for peace and human rights in the world. That was Mandela when he visited Tripoli in 1990. So Libya had ingratiated itself, despite its former relationship with Idi Amin. By 1990, Libya had, under Gaddafi, had ingratiated itself. And Gaddafi, after the 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda in 1994, Gaddafi had begun to talk about the principles of African unity. And in Gaddafi speaking about the principle of African unity, the West sought to identify African unity with Gaddafi as a way of discrediting African unity, as a way of saying, well, this African unity is coming from Gaddafi. Gaddafi was only saying what he learned from Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah learned from Marcus Garvey, because the question of African unity is the fundamental basis for the reconstruction of Africa, the fundamental basis for the harnessing of African resources for peace and reconstruction in Africa. So, NATO is actually fighting against the unification of Africa. The NATO intervention was to prevent Africans coming together. And we see this, and we see this hypocrisy all over Africa. Now, the United States has developed this new command. It's not new anymore, it's about 7 years old, called the U.S. Africa Command. And the U.S. Africa Command is supposed to bring peace and security to Africa. But the U.S. Africa Command has no legitimacy, because the U.S. military, in order to be legitimate in Africa, would have to explain to Africans the past relationship of the United States military. And there are 3 relationships that are very clear for Africans. 3 relationships that are very clear for Africans. The first, which the United States and its intelligence agencies have to account for, is the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. and the attempt to assassinate the Pan-African Project. The second is the support for the killing of African freedom fighters on the basis that they're supposed to be terrorists and communists. Every African freedom fighter who was fighting for liberation was called a communist. And the third is the assistance in incarcerating Mandela and arresting Mandela and supporting the apartheid. So the United States and Western intellectual agencies have no legitimacy in the eyes of most Africans, especially the African working people, because of the history of their their engagement with the West. And in my writings, I have said that the Africa Command has been established to prevent the full unification of Africa. It is there as an expedient to provoke insecurity across Africa. At every moment when Africans talk about unification, they bring some project to stop the unification. I want to mention three again. First, when Kwame Nkrumah talked about Pan-Africanism and the unification of Africa, the Western Europeans intervened in the Congo, killed Patrice Lumumba, and up to today, the Congo has not been stabilized. Secondly, in 1980, after the independence of Zimbabwe, when Africans talked about African unity and came up with the Lagos Plan of Action, they came up with the Berg Report and Structural Adjustment to roll back attempts at African unity. And thirdly, today, when Africans have gone through the steps of the CERT Declaration to bring about the Constitutive Act of Africa, they came up with the U.S. Africa Command. But the U.S. Africa Command was, for the first 2 or 3 years, giving itself a lot of publicity about how it is going to go about peace and security in Africa. But it has been discredited by the NATO intervention in Libya. And so the NATO intervention has brought clarity to the people of Africa, to the point that Africans compare the NATO intervention to the 1935 Italian invasion of Abyssinia. The cables from the US Embassy show that Gaddafi was against the US Africa Command. Gaddafi was promoting the idea that they should have the Africa High Command and there should be cooperation within Africa, from Africa. So this, in my view, are the full reasons for the Western intervention in Libya. As you know, Libyan reserves were seized by the US Treasury, by France, by Britain, and by Italy. And up to the time that I'm speaking now, a country like Libya has not returned, a country such as Italy has not returned the reserves of the Libyans. In fact, the Italians say, we will pay you back in kind. They're holding on to the money. The US Treasury is holding on to the money. The British is holding back onto the money. So we can see that the question of the African Monetary Fund, which is to be headquartered in the Cameroon, the African Central Bank, which is headquartered in Abuja, and the African Investment Bank. Sarkozy said that Libya was a threat to the financial security of the world. That these African institutions of reconstruction are a threat to the world. So, let me wind up by saying, what is our task? What is our task as intellectuals? What is our role in the midst of information warfare? Is our task to repeat the information that comes from the psychological warfare section of the Western media about Africa, about humanitarian intervention, and every time they come to Africa with some new kind of humanitarianism, they came with something called Coney 2012, I think you remember that one, where they tried to get 100 million young people. Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah. Okay, no problem. Yes. So this humanitarianism has always been an excuse for Western intervention in Africa. No imperialist will go to Africa to say, we're going there to exploit Africa. King Leopold, when he went into Africa in the 19th century, said he's going there to bring Christianity, civilization, and commerce. So it was then, so it is today. So NATO's responsibility to protect has been a disaster for the people of Africa. It was a regime change operation. African intellectuals, this is the point I want to make. African intellectuals have been very clear. In the appendix of this book, we have the open letter of African intellectuals. This open letter is Libya, Africa, and the New World Order. An open letter to the people of Africa and the world from concerned Africans. We, the undersigned, are ordinary citizens of Africa, who are immensely pained and angered that fellow Africans are and have been subjected to the fury of war by foreign powers, which have clearly repudiated the noble and very relevant vision enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. And they went on to say how Libya is an African country. UN produced no evidence that its use of force was legitimate. The UN made no effort to monitor the NATO operations, and the NATO carried out regime change. And the same intellectuals in Africa are calling for the United Nations to investigate the current instability of, but the demand that NATO should be examined, we don't see that demand being carried forward by the peace movement in North America. The peace movement in North America is not on the same page with the people of Africa. Let me make note of Tawerga and what has happened in Tawerga, where 30,000 black Libyans have been driven from their homes. And up to today, these people have not been able to return to their homes. The myth of African mercenaries in Libya. The Misrata militias were the militias who took Tripoli in the Misrata militias or the Misrata militias who took Tripoli. But in the book, I've harnessed enough evidence to show that the Misrata militias could not have taken Tripoli by themselves. The evidence was that there were 5,000 Qatari troops that fought with the Misrata militias. And the very same Misrata forces that are fighting General Hifter today are also involved in the destabilization of Libya. Okay, let me conclude. NATO declared at the end of October 2011 that their mission in Libya was a success, and that it was successful in ridding Libya of a government that was about to kill its citizens. Where are the citizens of North America and the peace movement in the evaluation of this success of NATO? Why is the peace movement so silent? In North America, where are the academics on the question of the success of NATO when we see the fighting that is going on every day in Libya? We know that Africans are very angry about what happened in Libya. The repercussions of the NATO intervention in Libya, in my mind, are similar to the end of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. For those of you who do not know, in 1935, the Italians invaded Abyssinia. The Italians went in to say, we did not get anything at the Berlin Conference, and after all, we were defeated at Adwa by Menelik. We are going to seize Africa. All over the world, Africans rebelled against the Italian invasion. In fact, the Rastafari movement in the Caribbean intensified its identification with Ethiopia after that. And after that intervention. And the International African Service Bureau was a Pan-African movement at that moment that intensified its work about African independence. So from 1935 to 1960, for 25 years, we saw the intense process of bringing about African independence after the Abyssinian intervention. I'm arguing in this book that the NATO intervention in Libya will have the same effect on hastening the process of the unification of Africa. Africans were so angry that the chairperson of the African Union was removed. The chairperson of the African Union was removed. And there was a new leadership in the African Union. And Nkosazana Zuma was placed as the chairperson of the African Union because the African Union and the African peoples felt that the people who were there with John Ping was not sufficiently active in resisting the NATO intervention. If I may, I would want to suggest that peace and reconstruction in Africa can be strengthened by our engagement as scholars who expose the duplicity of the West and their so-called humanitarianism. How do we repair the destruction of imperialism in Africa? The reparations movement is now one of the dominant forces in the Pan-African world. The Caribbean Reparations Commission have registered the question of repairing the destruction for the African peoples and African descendants from the transatlantic slave trade. The reparations movement says simply, slavery constituted a crime against humanity. But not only slavery, colonialism, apartheid. So the liberal ideas about civilization, Christianity, and commerce, that was the time of King Leopold. They call it governance, human rights, and security today. It's the same words to convey the same meaning. We have to have a research agenda that brings together emancipatory ideas about how Africans can reconstitute themselves for peace and for a better quality of life for the 21st century. Let me stop here and then we can discuss this in questions. Thank you.